Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. My name is Matt Gardner. I have Alyssa on the show today. Alyssa, how are you?
I am good. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so happy that you came on the show. I've been admiring you, specifically like your Instagram feed is just so money. I'm loving it. And you're one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram. So that's why I reached out to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I want people to learn about what you have going on specifically. We'll get into your origin story. But before we do, yeah, where can we find you online and what do you have going on these days?
Yeah, the best place to find me is Instagram. So at the Alyssa Stephenson. So I am a trauma-informed holistic health coach and somatic practitioner. So for people who aren't familiar with what somatic is, so what that is a body-centered approach to dealing with trauma because we store trauma in the body. So that's a little bit about the work that I do.
That's very cool. Yeah. And we'll definitely do a deep dive into that. I love that. Yeah. The
Yeah.
body centric, like some of the work that I do with, like we were talking about before we got started, like the story work coaching and breath work and such is like, I heard a phrase, something along the lines of like the body remembers what the mind forgets. Like we store all these memories and traumas and such. So yeah, really looking forward to getting into that with you. Yeah. Before we do, I'd love to hear just more about you and your story. I honestly, other than a couple minutes from us, starting before we started the rolling here, don't know too much about you. So I would love to just give you the open floor to tell us all about your origin story. I know you have a sobriety recovery story as well. And yeah, just the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your upbringing, and what what led you into the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. So for 15 years, I battled with a heavy alcohol and drug addiction. Starting at the age of 15 years old, I started just getting into hard drugs, hanging out with a bad crowd. I would say that my whole life, I just really struggled with anxiety and depression, severe social anxiety. So I just really had a hard time making friends. I was very quiet. So when I started using drugs and alcohol in high school, it just helped me be more outgoing, made me feel more confident. So I started hanging out with a very bad crowd. And then just one thing led to another. And it very quickly led to a heavy cocaine addiction. So I actually started dating a cocaine dealer at the age of 17 for 3 years. So everything really spiraled out of control. I did get sober at the age of 20 for a short while. I ended up getting pregnant with my daughter. But shortly after that, I just had a habit of getting into really abusive, violent relationships. And then again, just back into the cycle of addiction. And so by the age of 27 years old, I was in a very unhealthy, very abusive relationship. My alcohol addiction actually ended up spiraling out of control to the point where I had to have alcohol in my system 24/7. I was hiding it in my purse. I was bringing it everywhere with me. The best way to describe it, I'm sure you can relate. It's like, when I try and explain addiction to people, it's like a demon takes over your body. And for like so long, for so many years, I thought I had control over it, where I could go periods without it. I could go a few weeks without it. But eventually it got to that point where it was a full physiological addiction. And I had absolutely no control. I didn't even want to drink anymore. I hated drinking, but I could not stop because the withdrawal, the anxiety, and the depression were so unbearable. Was scared that I would kill myself if I stopped. So everything just spiraled out of control. I ended up leaving that relationship, thankfully, because it just got so bad that I knew that I wouldn't live if I stayed in that relationship. So I did move out. I got an apartment, literally moved in there with absolutely nothing, no furniture, started over from scratch, and then I lost my job. But that was my rock bottom, and that was what I needed, right, to get me onto the right path. So I actually went through a pretty profound spiritual awakening during that time. And that led me down a path of sobriety, celibacy, and deep inner work. And so for 4 years, I just relentlessly worked on just trying to pick the pieces up of my life, put them back together, and just get back onto the right path. And I explored a lot of different, you could say, modalities, therapies, just to really help me. But what I found was I didn't start to see an actual like drastic improvement. Even though my life was changing, I still had so many issues where I didn't feel safe around people. Mm-hmm. I didn't feel like I was ever present in my body. And the reason is that trauma actually causes us to disconnect from our bodies. So we actually eject from our bodies early on. If anyone's actually familiar with the work of Peter Levine, I actually highly recommend to look into that. So Peter Levine's work, he's a neurobiologist. He actually specializes in trauma. I don't even know how long he's been doing this work for, well over 40 years. He was actually the founder of somatic experiencing, and he actually observed animals in the wild. So, and he saw that what happens when an animal, so say an animal is about to be attacked by a predator. Mm-hmm. What happens is, so it gets into that fight and flight response, right? So it starts to run. And so like it's running at like 70 something kilometers an hour. So anyways, it's a lot of energy running through the body. And what happens is if it can't get away, if it's about to get attacked, it drops to the ground. And this goes into the immobility response. So if we can't fight or flight, that's our sympathetic response, we actually drop into immobility. So this is a freeze response. This is to protect us. And what actually happens is we actually, a part of our consciousness actually fragments off. It leaves our bodies in order to protect us if we end up getting eaten, right? That's why a lot of people, when they're in, say, a car accident, they don't actually start to feel the pain until after. Like if you break a bone, you don't feel the pain until after, right? It's right. Your body protecting you from that. So what he found was sometimes the animal would get eaten, but then sometimes the predator would actually go away and go get its cubs. So it could actually teach the cubs how to make the kill. And so when the animal left, when the predator left, the prey would actually, come out of that immobility response and it would shake. So animals shake so that they finish that energy discharge cycle. So remember, all of that energy for when it was in that fight and flight response running through its body, and then all of a sudden it collapsed. Now it gets up and it shakes it off so it can finish that energy discharge cycle. We as humans don't do that. We should, but because of our cultural programming, it's not seen as like socially acceptable. It would be weird if we did that, right? Like it's kind of shunned in our society to do these things. So we actually don't finish that energy discharge cycle. So we actually store trauma in our body.
Wow.
But yeah. Interesting thing is it doesn't always have to be a very, very traumatic incident, such as like a car accident or like getting attacked or war. It's a perceived threat as well, right? Like we still have that same reaction. We still go into that sympathetic response. So anytime that we have a perceived threat, we go into that exact same response. So every single one of us has experienced trauma. Trauma is anything that happens too much, too soon, too fast for our nervous system to handle without the presence of an empathetic witness.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Sorry, I'm just scribbling this down as we go. Yeah, so cool. It's I remember I'd heard that before. It was like a duck. The analogy, the duck was like they get in a fight and then like they both just kind of like shake it off and all that. So it's I had not heard it associated with like like an actual like predator and prey, whether it's so like in a grander scale with like a bigger mammal. I hadn't heard of it like that. And yeah, you're right though. And like even just shaking, like I remember years ago hearing about a podcast about somebody that was trying to catch that on, is like before you go into like a meeting where normally you'll feel anxiety, just shake it out. Like even if you have to go to the men's room or the ladies' room and just do it. So I remember that stuck with me too. So I'm piecing this together as you're wording it. So very interesting stuff. I want to get into the whole idea of like a perceived threat because and this will go to a couple different directions, but let's just start with that. So perceived threat, I mean, you hear a lot of different things like linking traumas back to when you're a childhood. So obviously your perception when you're like 5 years old is going to be such a different perception than when you're 20 yet. I know from there are some certain things that I can think back when I'm like 7 years old that have long since echoed into my adulthood, right? Like being made fun of at the baseball diamond for, a sticker I had on my baseball bat or something like that. So yeah, let's get into like the whole idea of like perceived threat, because let's face it, like when you're young and you're 5 years old, a perceived rejection by your parents means like you might not eat next, or, like your whole world is like those two people that you live with. Right. So yeah, what is your take on it? Or let's just jam on the whole idea of like perceived threat and how that shows up for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's I hear from so many clients at first that they didn't experience any kind of childhood trauma. And the idea of this isn't to actually blame our parents, but just so people can get an idea of what a perceived threat actually looks like. You can so say your mom was in the hospital having another baby, and she was there for a longer period of time. And if you were really young and you didn't know where your mom was, right, you would perceive that as being abandoned. And at that young of an age, that's life or death at that young of an age, right? There's also dental procedures was a big one that Peter Levine was finding, that a lot of people were dealing with a lot of trauma from dental procedures as kids, if they were put under, strapped down. So especially at such a young age, right? It all depends on how, because what this creates is actually a rupture in attachment, right? So it all comes back down to attachment theory. So when we have a secure attachment with our parents, we have a very healthy outlook on life, and we're able to attach securely in relationships. So, we have a very, very good relationship with ourselves. We're very present in our body. We don't get too anxious in relationships, and we're able to attach at like a healthy level, right? Like not at the very interdependent level, right? Like not very codependent, not anxious, not avoidant. But what happens is when we experience these ruptures, which what it is a rupture in attachment. A rupture in attachment is a disconnection from ourselves, a disconnection from our bodies. Then we start to have troubles in all of our relationships. It shows up like it's more obvious in more of our romantic relationships, but it shows up in our work relationships, in our friendship relationships, how we're able to really relate to others, right? Like how we're able to form relationships. If we anxiously kind of like chase relationships, and become kind of a little bit of like obsessive, or like always worried about rejection, or we can, the other way would be very like avoidant and avoiding intimacy and relationships altogether. So that's actually how it can show up, like something as small, like we don't even realize like how something so small in childhood can actually change the way that we perceive the world and the way that we're actually able to connect with everybody around us. It creates a rupture in attachment.
That's crazy to think, right? Like something that, happens when you're like 3 years old, and it just never gets resolved, never has a chance to get resolved. And it's subconscious programming or, conditioning or just running in the background. Right. And it's like, and it just continues to affect or show up, like you say, in intimate relationships. And like you said, like, to your point, absolutely. Like at work relationships, which can be a different type of intimate, like you're still seeing the person or exposed to this group of people for like 8 hours at a time, indirectly or directly. So I could see where that would, that's any spot where you can, all sides of you come out at some point or another, right?
Yeah. And we have a thing called neuroception. So it's a subconscious system that's always looking out into the world to observe whether the situations, the people, and the places that we encounter are safe, dangerous, or life-threatening. Now, the problem is often the situations that we perceive as dangerous or life-threatening, they often aren't. If they are, it's good, because then our neuroception detects that, and then we go into our sympathetic response, right? Our fight or flight response. But often it's not, because it just reminds us of a past trauma. Right.
Wow.
So like there's even certain people that you run into that reminds you of someone like in childhood. Maybe it was a bully or whatever, and a person that just reminds you of that, that's going to trigger that threat response. And then you're going to go into, depending on, because our nervous system is kind of mapped out in childhood. So we'll get into that too. So then that's going to trigger either your sympathetic response, or it's going to trigger your freeze or your dorsal response, your shutdown response, which I'll get into. So we actually have, we have 6, and this is based off of Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory. So we have 6 autonomic nervous system states that we can be in. So we are always in one of these 6 states. So we have, so the first one would be ventral. So ventral is what I would call our true nature, our core selves. This is when we are very calm, grounded, connected. We're in flow. We feel, this is our social engagement system. This is also a branch of the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is when we feel really connected with others. There's no rush to go anywhere. Everything's good. Everything's in flow, right? This is where we want to be. And then we have our sympathetic response. So that's our fight and flight. So what this would actually look like is this is very hypervigilant. This is anxious when we get anxiety. It can also look like anger. It's a lot of when we're in this state, we want to control things. We want to predict the future. We want to know the outcome, right? Like we feel like we're in threat. So that's our sympathetic response. So if we're not able to if we're not able to fight or flight the situation, what we go into next is dorsal. So dorsal is our shutdown response. So this is when we actually, our body basically shuts down. And what this looks like is like depression, apathy, very low energy. The thoughts that come up would be like, kind of like, what's the point of life? And we can get stuck in these states, right? That is dorsal. But then we also have a blended state of dorsal and sympathetic, and this is freeze. And what this looks like, and this is a very painful state to be in. What this looks like is, say you're driving a car and you have one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake. So it's,
okay.
You have all that sympathetic energy inside you, all of that anxiety and this need, like I have so much to do. I have all these things to do, but I just can't move forward.
Wow.
So that's freeze.
Yeah.
And then the other 2 states we have play, which is a mix of the ventral and sympathetic. So those are good states. And then we have stillness, which is a mix of ventral and dorsal. So remember, we are always in one of these 6 states. But the problem is that with our life, like in our culture, right, we're very rarely in ventral. So often many people find themselves in either like that sympathetic freeze or the dorsal response, right? So so that's what happens when neuroception, when we detect a threat, a perceived threat that reminds us of a past trauma, we go into one of these states.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, this is awesome. It feels like it's like a master class on all this stuff. So interesting.
It
really is. How long have you been doing this work for? This specifically, like getting into, the like the nervous system and the trauma work. Like, has this been like
for the past 5 years?
5 years. Okay.
This is the only thing that was able to bring me relief.
Wow.
So when I went through, like when I got sober and I went through all my trauma, I started having a lot of psychosomatic symptoms showing up in my life. So I was experiencing severe migraine headaches. My hair was falling out. I could not get out of bed some days. I had absolutely no energy. Like I would be able to just like get up out of bed, drive my daughter to school. I would come back and I would have to lie back in bed. Like I had absolutely no energy. I was losing so much weight. I dropped like 30 pounds within a month and a half. I was just very, very, very depressed.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get out of this state. So I came across Peter Levine's work about how we store trauma in the body. This is actually what happens. And the interesting thing is about this too. So our nervous system just wants to protect us. Like our body wants to protect us. These symptoms will not come online until our body feels safe enough to deal with them. So the interesting thing is I had left an abusive relationship. I had got sober. So now my body was in a place, like I was finally in a place where I could process this trauma. So what happens is all these symptoms start to show up because my body is now feeling safer. So it's not to get frustrated, because symptoms are just showing us something to look at, that it's something that we need to heal. So these were signs telling me it's something to heal. So I got into Peter Levine's work and learning all about the nervous system states, because I was obviously I was either in dorsal or I was in freeze all the time, right?
Yeah.
So then I was able to really understand it, because you just think that there's something wrong with you, but there's nothing wrong with you. When you're in these states, it's your nervous system trying to protect you, because our nervous system loves us so much. It sees a threat, is just stepping in and trying to protect us. So if you find yourself in one of these states, if you find yourself stuck in like just depression, having a hard time getting moving, just absolute no energy, just know that it's your body trying to protect you. And it's something that we need to look at. Now, in order to get ourselves out of these states, we do this through somatic work. So that's when I came across somatic experiencing from Peter Levine. And what that is starting to become, the first step is starting to just actually become more present in our bodies, because we are so disconnected from our bodies. We live in our heads majority of the time, right?
Yeah.
Like we live in an emotional phobic culture. And we also live in a culture that favors logic over sensation and emotion, right?
Yeah.
So step one is building a relationship with your body. So learning to be able to become more present and connected and grounded in your body. And there's many different somatic tools that we can use to be able to access this, to practice. And this takes practice, right? So that's step one. The next step is actually releasing trauma from our body. But the thing is, we don't want to do that on our own. We want to, because remember, trauma is anything that happens too much, too soon, too fast, without the presence of an empathetic witness. So we actually need an empathetic witness present with us to help us heal and release trauma. So there's many ways that we can do that through somatic experiencing techniques, working like with a somatic experiencing practitioner or any kind of therapist or practitioner or coach that is trained in somatic work. Somatic breath work is a really great way, but you always want to work with someone so we feel safe when we actually release or able to like release this trauma. Then the next step is regulation, because we want to be able to regulate our nervous system. And again, this is like self-soothing exercises and incorporating a lot more of these somatic tools into our practice. So those were the steps that I took on my healing journey.
Cool. So did you end up, did you get into breath work? Because like, I know that's a really popular one these days. And I've been like last, I'd say 18 months, I took way more care and awareness into my breathing patterns and actually being a lot more conscious about it. Was that one of yours? Or if you don't mind me asking, like, what were some of those like activities that were really successful for you?
Yes. Okay. I'm so glad we're getting into this. I'm actually going next week to get certified in somatic breathwork release with Steve Jaggers. He's like the founder of somatic release. It's in Austin, Texas. So I'm looking forward to that.
Very cool.
But breathwork changed my life.
Okay. Cool.
Yes. So I actually went to, and I'm excited to hear your experience with breathwork too. I want you to get into that and share yours, because so my first experience, I actually went to, and I believe it was like a holotropic breathwork ceremony.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So have you done that?
Yeah. It's like, so it's the thing is like, there's so many different variations. And then as soon as somebody explained and I saw the YouTube video, I'm like, yeah, I've totally done this. But the person that was facilitating it didn't say it was holotropic, but yeah, I know which one you mean. And yeah, it was, dude, crazy. I'll get into mine. You first though. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for anyone who doesn't know, who's never tried it, so you're breathing for a long time. It was like the one that I went to is over 2 hours, but it's deep belly breathing, and it actually takes you to an altered state of consciousness. So it's a lot of clearing. So deep belly breathing for 2 hours. That was the one that I went to. And then all of a sudden, like the girl went around. So there was, it was a couple that were facilitating it together, and they'll go around, and if you feel safe, they'll put their hands on you if you want them to. You don't have to. You can always say no if you don't want any touch. That's completely okay. But anyway, she went around. She's like, "Is it okay if I help you?" She put her hands on me, and my body just started to shake.
Mm.
Um, and this is what happens, right? Like we start to actually release that trauma. So my body just started to shake like crazy. And then nothing's going on in my head. So it's not like there's memories coming up. It's completely a body centered experience, like completely just physical. So all of a sudden I just started releasing like all this grief. So grief started coming up. I like went down the fetal position. I started to shake. And then I started to feel like anger, and they want you to release that anger. Like anger is healthy, right? Like it's so shunned in our society. We don't want
Yeah.
to direct your anger out at people, but we want to be able to like release it and process it.
Yeah.
So I released all this anger. So she got me to kind of start kicking a pillow, slamming the ground. So I did that. And then all of a sudden I just felt bliss. I
Mm.
felt joy. I had tears of joy streaming down my face. It was the most
Wow.
incredible experience. I felt my heart, like I physically felt my heart crack open. And I said to
Wow.
her, I'm like, my heart's opening. Yeah. And so that was my
Wow.
first experience with breath work. My experiences after that weren't as intense. Like that was a pretty intense experience. The others were more like nurturing and grounding, but it changed my life. It changed my
Yeah.
way, the way that I'm able to connect with others. It helped me open up to connecting more with others. Yeah, it was just a profound experience. So I love to hear about yours.
Yeah. Well, that's so cool. Yeah. It's mine wasn't 2 hours. That's so intense. It's like I've done an hour at a time. And honestly, like we have like you have that control over, how like the energy that you're that I, that's how I felt anyways. Like I took my foot off the gas pedal is because I was getting nervous about what was happening. So my first experience, I was probably like 20 minutes into it. And like I had, I guess what they call like the lobster claws. Like I literally couldn't move my hands anymore, and my face was numb. And I was like, I don't know. I didn't know what to expect. But I certainly hadn't. They're like, by the way, you're gonna experience this. So I was like, is this normal? So I remember trying to be like, I'm trying to like, I called somebody over, like the guy over, and I was like, is this normal? And they're like, yeah, you're fine. And like, okay. But after that, I had a hard time like pushing myself that far again, just because but yeah, so that was it. Like I had like a really intense energetic release or something going on with my hands. My face was numb. I don't generally sweat too bad, like unless I'm in hot yoga or something. I was just like drenched, and I was like, whoa. And that was like 20 minutes in. And since then, I've been a little bit nervous about, you know what I mean? I'll walk up to my threshold just because I know
Totally.
what to expect now. And then I'm a little bit more like articulate or expressive with my body, just because it helps me feel a little bit more comfortable. So I've been a little bit apprehensive about going full on since that one time. But yeah, it was incredibly intense. And yeah, the times that I have since then have been, feel incredibly collaborative and creative. And yeah, I want to say that's more like my true self, without any like fear of rejection. You know what I mean? Like I'll have these like, oh, I'm gonna call this person, or like I want to however it shows up, without any inhibitions. And it just feels wonderful, and it'll echo for like the rest of my day like that if I have a really good breathwork session. So I love it. But yours sounds incredible, and it's so cool that you're able to deal with and heal all that accumulated, trauma and energy that you had stored for like that early on in your life. What a crazy story. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the nice thing about breath work too. It's like we can slow down our breath. It's not like a plant
Right.
medicine where it's like once you take too much, there's no
Yeah.
going back.
Yeah. Just another 14 hours, you'll be fine, Yeah. Which actually I'm curious because I'm not sure. Have you done any plant medicine as well, or?
So I have done psilocybin, and that was
Okay.
really
Yeah.
helpful. So
Yeah.
psilocybin really helped me in the early stages of recovery. I do feel a calling to do an ayahuasca ceremony. I just want to be really careful with who I do it with.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's something I'm looking into, and I do believe one day eventually I will do that, but I have done psilocybin. How about for yourself?
Yeah, so I did a like Bufo or a 5-MeO retreat last April. So it's coming up on a year. And crazy, like crazy profound. I don't know if you're overly familiar, if you've watched any videos or anything on it. Yeah, so it's like they call it like the Mount Everest of psychedelics, right?
I,
So it's like it was crazy. So we did like you do like the titrated amounts, I guess. So the first one's like a handshake, and it was crazy, dude. It was like as soon as I exhaled, just because everything happened so quickly, I realized this, like what I perceived was a limiting belief in myself was actually like my mom's energy, and it was like her protective energy. And I just started crying. And that was like within like seconds. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I understand that about myself now. So very much like you're talking about, it really helped me get reconnected with just sensations in my body that was just ignoring or just like completely had blinders onto. And dude, it was crazy. So the second one is called hug. And that was like, I swear, like my inner dialogue got turned down to like maybe one. And it was all just, I was in my body. I was doing all this like intuitive tapping on myself. And it was like, yeah, it was really got me back into my like heart to my, like the heart body mind connection. And yeah, I've honestly, it's been like that since. Like it's really allowed me to find that connection again. And yeah, there was so much positive that came out of it, and so much realizations of like, oh, that's what that pattern is, like realizing what the origin is, really truly like embodying certain words like unconditional love. Like I'd say that in affirmations to myself and such, but there was always a little bit of skepticism, right? I'm like, I don't know about this. And then actually like feeling it, like I experienced it in my body. So I have this like part of me that I can like, okay, I've felt it, I've experientially, gone through it, and now I know what that term and that like I know what it means now, right? It's not just like a set of words, right? So yeah, it was crazy. So 3 days of that. So it was like the handshake, the hug, and the full embrace, which was just nuts. And yeah, it was like fearful. It was like, yeah, all the above, and just realizing that like, yeah, there's no, it really removed my like hierarchy, this idea of like hierarchy of feelings, like there's bad feelings or shameful feelings and good. It's just like everything was just came up to the surface and was invited to stay there and allowed. I just kept saying to myself, apparently, like allow over and over again. I would say it, and it was, yeah, highly recommend it. It's incredible. And then it's not like what you talked about with ayahuasca, where it's like, yeah, you're in for like a 14-hour ride. So if it goes dark, you gotta put your seatbelt on, kind of thing. It's like, 20 minutes, half hour, and you're more or less back to normal, right? So yeah, it was profound experience. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so many things actually just popped out when you were saying that. Okay, so when you talk about that unconditional love,
Yeah.
so that is actually, I don't know if you're familiar with like internal family systems work.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and this is like endorsed by like Gabor Mate and
Yeah.
Bessel van der Kolk.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's like that's what they would call our true self, our core self, right? Like, is that unconditional love? And like when you were mentioned too, like when you were able to feel like that presence of like that mother, like that nurturing presence, it's like we're reparenting ourselves. Like when we go through this healing process, we reparent ourselves. Like that's actually how we heal these mother and these father wounds that we have, is by coming home to self and by reparenting ourselves. And it's almost like, this sounds crazy, but it's like we release our parents when we do this healing work of like that duty of like all these expectations, these unmet expectations that we didn't receive from them. We how we heal that is coming home to ourselves, coming home to our bodies, coming home to our true natures, our core self, that unconditional love. That's our true nature. And that's how we reparent ourselves. And like you had mentioned too earlier, you said like how, like just doing this work, how you just found that you're able to, like find that confidence of like even just reaching out to people, like doing a podcast and stuff like that, right? And like reaching out to people that normally you probably would have been nervous to do. And I found that same way. Because the funny thing is, I was like, it's so crazy that I'm even like doing this work now, because I was like so shy and so avoidant before. I'm not anymore. But when we do this healing work, we actually uncover, like, that's why people are like, why would you even want to do that? Like, that just sounds painful. Doing inner child work just sounds painful. It's like, no, it's like when we look at our darkness, we're actually shining a light on it. And when we shine a light on our darkness, we uncover more of our true essence, our childlike essence. And what were we like as children? We would go up and talk to anybody. We would go and hug anybody. We were creative. We were playful. So it's like when we do this work, when we do this trauma healing, this inner child work, this reparenting, we're uncovering more of that true essence, more of our natural selves. We're coming home to ourselves. We're finding our lost creativity, our lost joy, our lost passion, our playfulness, our confidence, right? So
yeah, 100%. Yeah, exactly. And there's like, and honestly, I'd much rather have gone this direction. Like, so I did like a career pivot a couple years ago, and honestly, I could have continued on. Like, I'm coming up on 4 years alcohol free in April, and they kind of went hand in hand, because I could have easily, well, maybe not so easily, that's the whole problem, is continued to just work the, you know, the career that I've been doing for 20 plus years for another 15 years, coming home, having my drinks, and just like continuing that. But as soon as I removed that numbing agent, there was very apparent something showing up inside of me energetically that I couldn't explain or articulate, but it was there, and I couldn't not listen to it anymore. And you know, and that's what guided me into this whole thing. And to me, I would have much rather had this like last 2 years of like, you know, some uncomfortability, sure. But man, like you say, like I feel like so much more centered and closer to me, and I've released so many of these patterns, still a work in progress. But some of these like patterns I'm like looking at like into my rearview mirror, which I was so in before. And honestly, like I just would have continued to go about it. So when somebody says that to me, it's like, and there is people that shy away from the whole like this type of coaching that we do, right? But man, I like if I'm on the other side of it, there's no way I would ever go back to the way it was before. And now I'm so much more comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable is kind of relative, right? I'm not, to me, like that's growth. That's like my growing, you know, like growing pains, like when you're younger and had a growth spurt. That's how I view it. Like I kind of like it when I feel a little bit blue now. You know what I mean? As opposed to before, I would do distractions or whatever to get, nope, I'm not feeling that way. Let's check my email, you know, and now I'm like, cool, this is back. And it helps me like feel creative. And yeah, that's a whole kind of rant there. But yeah, like it's the whole uncomfortability part that you talked about. Man, it's you know, it gets, as soon as you get kind of comfortable with being uncomfortable, you can make so much progress on so many different things, can't you?
yes, I love that you said that. And two, it's okay. So that is our neuroception. When things start to feel uncomfortable, that's our neuroception kicking, like coming online, telling us that no, this doesn't feel safe, because we start to feel these sensations of not feeling comfortable. So how we actually heal, because these are all like, it's triggering a past trauma, right? It's putting our nervous system into dysregulation. That's why it feels uncomfortable. And then all these body sensations are starting to show up. So like you said, it's like getting comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And it's like really what we're doing is we're learning to sit in those sensations, and we're showing our nervous system that it's safe, because our nervous system will actually block us from moving towards the things that we want in life. So our nervous system is just trying to protect us, but it actually, like, so say for an example, if it was never safe to use your voice before, say for an example, like some people have a really hard time, and a lot of people have a hard time with public speaking or like going on a podcast or doing this sort of stuff. It's a fear of rejections. There's a lot of different fears that come up, right? Because it reminds us of something in the past. So all of a sudden what happens is like, oh, I can't speak. My heart gets too elevated. I go into sympathetic too much. So it's like, if we just actually show ourselves like, okay, let's just start taking small, tolerable steps. Like that's how I started doing podcasts. Like you just start, you know, like it could go awful. That's the potential, but you gotta just start, right?
Yeah.
And then you just are like, you just sit in that sensation, and then you show your nervous system. It's like, even if it did go horrible, it's like, you survived it.
Yeah, you're still
like
alive.
You survived it. Yeah, you're still alive.
Yeah.
It's not a life or death situation. So that's actually how we move through these things. It's just our nervous system trying to protect us. When anything feels uncomfortable, it's just trying to protect us. So we take small, tolerable steps, and we want to show our nervous system that it's safe, because it's not enough to tell it. We don't communicate with affirmations or like by telling our nervous system that it's safe. We got to take action.
Ooh, that's so good. That's so good. You know, and that's so interesting. I found like, just on the subject of affirmations, because for the longest time for me, it was like I would say them, and there was nothing really supercharging them, right? And like there was always like the, it's like a heckler at like a stand-up, bullshit, and I'm like, no, like this is affirmations. And then I started adding the breathing. So I'd say an affirmation and breathe, and it's like inviting it into my body, right? So there was a degree of a connection. So I've made a lot of gains on that, but I love just the way that you said that's like 5 steps further is just like familiarizing the actual body and the sensations and showing. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. That's so exciting. It's funny. I just on a side note, I'm actually going to a hypnotherapist, my first one tomorrow, under the whole idea of like, I was similar to you, painfully shy as a child. If a girl talked to me, I go red, and then my game is over at that point. They're like, oh, why are you red? And I'm like, don't talk to me, right? And I was like, oh, and that was like into my like high school. I'm like, this is brutal, right? So yeah, like that, of course, that shows up in public speaking, like even in a group of my peers, I will go red. And I have this like kind of like scopophobia, like fear of like, if I can't maintain eye contact with everybody, I just feel like I'm being watched and I feel threatened. And I have this like idea that I'm super vulnerable and they're going to start making fun of me. And you know what I mean? So that definitely shows up from my childhood. So, and that's been like, I've been trying to affirmations and I've tried meditating on it. So, but I definitely have this like core fear of rejection, specifically like in like the physicality of being like rejected in front of a group of people, like the embarrassment, the humiliation. I lose control. I start bawling. Like I would have rather just died. But then, you know what I mean? When I was like 5, like, or like 10, I think it was even like I was at baseball
Totally.
time. Right. So I'm actually going to go to a hypnotherapist tomorrow, as we talked about plant medicine. We talked about breath work. So this is like my, another like modality, I guess, that I'm trying to, pierce time or collapse time and make up for some lost time or something. Have you had any experience with hypnotherapy, or do you have an opinion on it one way or the other?
Yeah. So I went to a past life regression.
Oh,
I had a past life regression hypnotherapy, and
very
that was
cool.
pretty crazy. That was pretty
Yeah.
intense. Because I truly believe that a lot of our trauma, like a lot of our trauma, some of it is from this life, like a portion of it. A lot of it is generational. A lot of it is past life. A lot of our trauma that we carry is past life. So I did go for a past life regression hypnotherapy. And it just
Very
made
cool.
sense
Yeah.
with what came up. But I never had that would be the only type of hypnotherapy that I actually went to was that. Yeah.
Very cool. I love that. Even just on the thought, I mean, that's the whole like ancestral healing, and it's like I know, for example, like the coaching certification that I took is, as I mentioned, with the breathing involved with like narrative therapy and such. My instructor always said is like, you inherit more than your eye color from your parents. Like it's breathing patterns. It's like their like perception of stress and perhaps some of their traumas. There's that whole experiment on like the lab rats where like, I forget exactly what it was. I should have thought about that before I opened my mouth about it. But there was something along the lines of like, there was rats that got electric shock if there's a perfume got injected into their cage, and then their kids who never actually had the electric shock still had a traumatic reaction to the perfume. So this idea that you get this trauma that's passed down to you as well, right? So I'm like, isn't that curious? Isn't that just crazy?
Well, even Peter Levine was saying, because he's worked with, well, like hundreds and hundreds of patients, right? But one thing that was coming up was a lot of his patients were having symptoms of, and this is going to sound really morbid, but this is what was coming up. They were having symptoms of smelling burning flesh.
Wow.
And then he
Wow.
ended up looking into this, and like all of them were descendants of Holocaust survivors, all of them.
Oh man.
So, and these people were dealing with like trauma and just like all these like symptoms that a Holocaust survivor would have like dealt with. They
Wow.
were dealing with it. So yeah, it
It's a
does.
real
It's
thing.
generational. It's ancestral. It
Yeah.
gets passed down. Yeah.
Wow. And I wonder if that has something to do with just on an evolutionary level, right? It's like you don't, it won't be exposed to the same things that your ancestors were exposed to. It's like a way of like, learning without having to be like verbalized. It's like it's in your DNA essentially. Like, yeah, it's like like a way of evolution in a sense, right?
Yeah. And you know what? I personally truly believe just we're at a time right now on the planet, collectively, where it's like we're being forced to look at this stuff. Like we've
Yeah.
got this
Yeah.
trauma like going forward. So that's why I just feel like a lot more people are starting to have to deal with this. And they do say these symptoms will actually get worse as it's passed down generation. But it's like we have to look at this stuff. Like we
Yeah.
have to, we're not just doing it for ourselves, we're doing it for future generations, right? When
Yeah.
we heal this. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. 100%. That's a great way to, yeah, to wrap things up. This hour went by very quickly. I'd love to have you back on at some point as well. I want to get into what you have going on and just give everybody an opportunity to find you, because you have a podcast as well, do you?
Yeah. I have a
Awesome.
podcast called The Awaken with Alyssa podcast.
Okay.
So yeah, you can find me on there. And then so I offer one-on-one coaching. So you can work with me. You can find me again on Instagram at the Alyssa Stephenson. And I do have a 6-week program coming up in April, which I'll be giving more information about if you follow me on Instagram. And it's all about navigating your nervous system in relationship. So
Ooh.
your nervous system is the only thing standing in your way of having the relationships that you desire. The only thing. So it's just learning
Wow.
about how to actually work with our nervous system so that we can actually have the intimacy and the connection that we want in relationships. So that's what that whole 6-week program is going to be. And then what that's going to look like is, so it's going to be 6 weeks of live calls. You'll get one-on-one coaching with me. And then we'll also do including in those 6 weeks, we'll be doing 3 somatic breath work release sessions as well. So
Very cool. I
yeah.
love that. That's so it's such a unique program. I love it. And I imagine very much based on like, some of the origin story that you gave, right? As far
Yeah.
as, like your own story and all that. So, which is always powerful when you have that life experience coupled with this, all the extra learning that you've been doing and such. So that sounds like an amazing program. So all the best for you with that. Thank you so much for coming on. I do have one other topic I wanted to touch on before we wrapped up. We talked about, the releasing of the trauma and such. You and I both have our, compulsive, addiction recovery stories. What is your thoughts on, like pharmaceuticals and such, which are still, is there a place for it? You know what I mean? Like, does that help, or is that just sort of like still, is pharmaceuticals, can they work with some of the work that you're doing as well? Or would you is it different? I know obviously it's different between, different people and what they have going on and such, right? But I just overall like a general, general question on that.
Yeah. So my personal opinion, and it's changed. I used to be like so against like pharmaceuticals like altogether. But my perception on that now is because sometimes we need these things just to get by. I feel like we're too reliant on that. We're just looking for these quick fixes and we're not actually getting to the root cause. So I'm a holistic health coach. I'm all about getting to the root cause, but I do believe that they do have a place because sometimes people just need them for temporary relief, right? Like
Totally.
I do believe that I believe more so in an integrative approach because I hate to say that no one should ever take them. I don't believe that because I do believe that there's a place for them for sure. But as long as we're like proactively working towards not being dependent on something and actually doing the lifestyle changes necessary, so that we can hopefully not depend on them and get off of them, right? But sometimes you do need pharmaceuticals just if you just need to cope in that moment.
Yeah.
I can resonate with that. So
yeah, totally. Yeah, very well put. Very well put. Alyssa, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's a pleasure getting to know you, and yeah, really great conversation. Any final words, any final thoughts on, if some folks are at the beginning of their journey, right? If they like picture yourself, a few years ago, like what would be just a final topic to cover off before we wrap things up?
yeah, I would just say that it's a journey. You need support. We heal in community. You will not do this on your own. I tried to do it on my own. You won't. So number one thing is find people that you can trust and that you can connect with and that you can relate to, because we are communal beings. And that I would say is the number one thing that I would recommend is find support.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.